Hi there, and thanks for joining me. My name is Chris Ramensky, and this is my presentation for Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs. And the topic is the loss of cultural identity. How has the loss of cultural identity impacted on the education and well-being of Indigenous Australian students? And what innovations in teaching and educational support for Indigenous Australian and ESL students is available? What is cultural identity? Cultural identity is the collective, subjective identity of individuals and ideas belonging to a group. Cultural identity is a learnt phenomenon and impacts on the ways an individual and those of the group understand and interpret the world around them. Characteristics of cultural identity could be related to an understanding of nationality. For example, in Australia, we celebrate the 26th of January as Australia Day, and in the US, the 4th of July is celebrated as Independence Day. Thus, these particular dates would have significance for students of these nations. It could be related to ethnicity, such as being Indian, African, or Asian, or it could be related to religious beliefs, such as identifying as Christian, Muslim, or Hindu. Let's reflect on that momentarily and look at the examples of Australia Day in particular. And in the media recently, there have been a number of local councils that have rejected the notion of celebrating Australia Day, as in the Aboriginal context, for them they use the term Invasion Day, and this is a sore point, to say the least, but one that has the potential to pervade into the classroom on and around these particular dates, and also in the context of history and education. So what may be a celebration for one student may be a nightmare for another. And there are many other subtle differences, and other common subtle cultural differences, could include religious beliefs and around food. There are many Indian religious beliefs that revolve around vegetarianism, and the Jewish religion, they don't eat pork or pig, and indeed the Seventh-day Adventists are also very proud of living a vegetarian diet. So let's move on. How does cultural identity affect education? According to Pierce, 1995, social identity is multiple and contradictory, and that a learner cannot isolate his or her cultural identity while learning due to continual dependence on their cultural knowledge. And Seng, 2002, states that it is clear that there is a link between learning and cultural identity. What this means is that having a cultural identity is like looking through a lens. As students, we cannot help but see and understand the world around us from our own cultural bias. For example, in some cultures, Muslim women aren't allowed to touch men, including shaking hands, unless they are immediate family. Now, this might not seem like the most obvious example, but in Australia we have a strong emphasis on physical education, and there are a lot of outdoor activities and sports in the playground, and there's a lot of incidental contact, be it through passing a ball or playing a game of tag, throwing and catching. People bump into each other, and if for one student some of these activities are culturally inappropriate, they may not engage or interact, and that may have flow-on effects into the classroom, greater than any social embarrassment or ostracizing by the other students, but it may in fact affect their ability to participate and get involved. What cultural bias, if any, is inherent in education? Cultural bias occurs in education when the subjective assumptions from one culture clash with the subjective assumptions of another. Take, for example, these following cultural greeting styles. In Tibet, monks stick their tongue out to greet people. In the Philippines, elders touch your forehead with their hand. In Japan, people greet each other with a bow. In India, they put their hands together as if in prayer over their heart. In Oman, men greet each other by touching noses. And in Malaysia, they touch their fingertips and then they touch their heart. So, while these examples are not from the classroom, they do set the premise for obvious misunderstanding. You look at the picture on the slide here, where the woman is reaching out to shake the man's hand and he's bowing. So both of their subjective assumptions are not in alignment with the assumptions of the other culture. Australian Aboriginal cultural identity. In Australia, Indigenous communities keep their cultural heritage alive by passing their knowledge of arts, rituals and performances from one generation to another, speaking and teaching languages, protecting cultural materials, sacred and significant sites and objects. In Indigenous communities, to dance is to be knowledgeable about the stories of ancestral heroes. Songs and dances were exchanged often at large ceremonial gatherings, where many people gathered together and when trade goods were also exchanged. Knowledge is learnt through a process of initiation, and gaining an understanding of Aboriginal law is by definition not public knowledge. These principles are in stark contrast to Western ideas. What was life like before colonialism? Before colonialism, there were approximately 700 languages spoken throughout Australia, with an estimated population of 750,000 people. Today, Indigenous people make up about 2% of the Australian population, or about 410,000 people. The early Europeans took a dim view of the Aboriginal way of life when they first encountered it. Here's a quote from 1788. "We found the natives tolerably numerous as we advanced up the river, and even at the harbour's mouth we had reason to conclude the country more populous than Mr. Cook thought it. For on the Supply's arrival in the bay on the 18th of the month, they assembled on the beach of the south shore to the number of not less than 40 persons, shouting and making many uncouth signs and gestures." To most settlers, the Aboriginal people were considered akin to kangaroos, strange fauna like dingoes and emus to be eradicated to make way for the development of farming and grazing. By the late 1800s, there were systematic removal practices being implemented through a range of assimilation and protection policies. By 1869, the Aboriginal Protection Board was given quite broad powers to make law for the care, custody and education of the children of Aborigines. One of the regulations under the Act allowed for the removal of any Aboriginal child neglected by its parents or left unprotected. They were removed to a mission, an industrial or reform school, or to a station. Assimilation practices. New legislation was introduced almost everywhere by 1940 to assimilate Indigenous people of mixed descent. During the 1950s and 60s, great numbers of Indigenous children were removed from their families. Not only were they removed for alleged neglect, they were removed to attend school in distant places, to receive medical treatment, and to be adopted out at birth. Living conditions in children's institutions were often very harsh. The boys were called inmates in many of the official reports of the time. Doris Pilkington described the conditions as more like a concentration camp than a residential school for Aboriginal children. Key points in the history of the loss of Aboriginal identity. 1901, the White Australia Policy. Non-whites are banned from entering Australia and Aboriginal natives are not counted as people. 1909, the Aboriginal Protection Act. Exclusion of Aboriginal children from government schools. Aboriginal schools teach manual trades. There are legal powers to remove Aboriginal children from their parents. 1920. Current estimates put the Aboriginal population at 70,000. This is less than 10% of pre-colonialism. 1934, the Aborigines Act. It becomes possible for Aborigines to cease being Aboriginal by making an application to the court. 1937, Assimilation Policy. Attempts to assimilate mixed-race Aborigines are furthered with greater legal powers to remove Aborigines from their families and force them into white communities. 1940. The establishment of the New South Wales Aborigines Welfare Board. At this time, the population of Australia is estimated at 99% white. 1949. Aboriginal people are given the right to vote so long as they can prove that they have served in the military. 1950. Aboriginal children are allowed to attend government schools on the condition that the parents of the white children allow this. 1958. The Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines is established. 1962. The Commonwealth Electoral Act extends the right for all Aboriginal people to vote in federal elections, but not state elections. In 1965, or not necessarily state elections, some states it's allowed. In 1965, the integration policy replaces the assimilation policy, and Charles Perkins is the first Aboriginal person to graduate from university. And in 1967, the Commonwealth referendum votes in favour of counting Aboriginal people in the census. So you see that there was systemic official destruction of the Aboriginal culture. The status quo. In Australia, most teachers lack any previous experience with Indigenous persons and migrant ESL children before they are employed as teachers. Given that Indigenous children and migrant ESL children achieve less in school when compared to white Anglo students, it is important that teachers develop an understanding of the issues to deliver a better result. Research suggests that professional development of teachers should employ a multimodal approach to address the impacts on both teaching and learning. It is not just the teaching methodology that requires change. For instance, when Indigenous content such as values and history are incorporated into the curriculum that includes a culturally appropriate method of teaching, then the Indigenous students are more likely to engage and in turn they get better results. Consulting with local Indigenous community members is an excellent way to develop new ideas and concepts. A series of studies dating back to the 1970s show the extent to which the Indigenous people of Australia have been marginalised and how this now serves as a predictor to their educational outcomes. The reports clearly identified the socio-economic markers for the Indigenous population and it led to the Hawke government in 1987 to develop the Aboriginal Employment Development Policy, which aimed to reduce the income, education and unemployment gap between the Aborigines and other Australians. The policy was not without its challenges, and the Aboriginal people were resisting the program because they felt that it was insensitive to their needs. Current initiatives and innovations in education and support include Closing the Gap. Closing the Gap is a government strategy that aims to reduce disadvantage among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with respect to life expectancy, child mortality, access to early childhood education, educational achievement and employment outcomes. It is a formal commitment made by all Australian governments to achieve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health equality within 25 years. The targets are close the gap in life expectancy within a generation, halve the gap in mortality rates for Indigenous children under 5 within a decade, ensure all Indigenous 4-year-olds in remote communities have access to early childhood education within 5 years, halve the gap for Indigenous students in reading, writing and numeracy within a decade, halve the gap for Indigenous students in Year 12 attainment or equivalent attainment rates by 2020, and halve the gap in employment outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians within a decade. It also includes HEP, the Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program. The Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program aims to ensure that Australians from low socio-economic backgrounds who have the ability to study at university have the opportunity to do so. It provides funding to assist universities implement strategies that improve access to undergraduate, as well as improving the retention and completion rates of students. From the 1st of January 2018, the government will reform HEP into 2 components: the Access and Participation Fund and the National Priorities Pool. The participation and partnership components of HEP will be combined to form the Access and Participation Fund, with universities required to allocate a minimum amount of funding to partnership activities. Funding from the Access and Participation Fund will be provided in 2 streams, and these are the streams outlined here. ELIC, English Language Learning for Indigenous Children. The Australian Government has committed $5.9 million from 2017-18 to 2020-21 to trial a series of applications to be used in preschool to improve English literacy outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children for whom English is a second language. Consultations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities will inform best practices for learning in order to develop the program, as well as culturally relevant content. The trial will be run for 2 calendar years over 2019 and 2020 in at least 20 preschools focusing on regional and remote areas. This measure is based on the successful ELA, Early Learning Languages Australia program that was made nationally available in 2017. ELA. ELA is a child-centered program specifically aimed at children in the year before school. It includes a suite of materials including apps, resource material and educator support networks developed through the ELA trial to support the effective delivery of early language learning in preschool services. The aim of the program is for children to have early experience in language learning as an important platform for encouraging language learning in the later years of education. The key objectives of the program are to introduce children to words, sentences and songs in a language other than English, give children opportunities to recognize sounds and concepts of the language, provide children with appropriate experience and practice in the language, provide engaging and educational play-based language learning experiences. The Australian Government provided $9.8 million for a 1-year trial of ELA in 41 preschool services nationally to determine the effectiveness of children learning a language through apps without a proficient language teacher. So in summary, we still have a long way to go in terms of identifying cultural bias and developing and adopting strategies to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and ESL students. And the challenge is that the school environment remains a cultural continuation of our predominantly white Western ideologies. And I thought there are some great points here on this infographic, some of them which I'd like to read out. Diversity discussions do not have to alienate. With thoughtful planning, such as discussion, we can change students' minds and perhaps even their hearts. The focus of school improvement efforts should not be on fixing kids, but rather on fixing institutions that reinforce race and class-based stratification. It can be difficult for us to grasp that people shaped by other cultures will see and respond to the world differently than we do. By failing to give our students the facts about racial history, we are ensuring that this avoidance will persist for subsequent generations. Language diversity is a potential asset, but schools are not doing their part to nurture that asset. And educators in diverse classrooms don't necessarily need to change their identity and belief, but they do need to realize that no situation is value neutral. Thanks very much for paying attention, and I look forward to your feedback on my presentation.